My estranged son is an FBI agent, and he had not spoken to me in 8 months. So when my phone lit up with his name at 3 minutes past midnight, I knew someone was either dead or about to die. He did not say hello. He just whispered, "Turn off every light in the house right now. Get to the attic, lock the heavy door, and do not make a sound. If your son-in-law finds you, you are a dead man." I told him he was scaring me. He just shouted, "Do it." I dragged my 76-year-old bones up those stairs, and what I saw through the floorboards made me wish I had just stayed in bed and let them kill me. It was a Tuesday. A quiet, freezing November night in Ohio. The kind of night where the winter wind howls through the bare trees across my 50-acre estate, masking any sound from the outside world. I was sound asleep. I am a heavy sleeper. When you spend 30 years of your life sleeping in the back of a freezing semi-truck cab on the side of the highway, you learn to sleep through just about anything. I built my interstate logistics empire from a single rusted-out rig. I drove through blizzards, missed birthdays, and destroyed my knees, all to make sure my family would never have to know the kind of poverty I grew up in. I thought I had finally earned my peace. I reached over to the nightstand, my joints aching with that familiar dull throb. I grabbed the phone. The screen was blindingly bright in the pitch-black room. Derek. My oldest son. Derek and I had not been on speaking terms. We are too much alike. Both stubborn, both rigid. He walked away from the family business years ago to join the bureau in Washington, and we had barely spoken since his mother, my beloved Catherine, passed away. I swiped the screen to answer, expecting bad news about a car crash or a hospital visit. But I did not expect the sheer vibrating panic in my boy's voice. "Dad," Derek whispered. His voice was completely stripped of that arrogant federal agent tone he usually carried. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not turn on the bedside lamp. Do not speak louder than a whisper. I need you to get out of bed, walk down the hall, and climb up to the attic. Lock the deadbolt behind you." I sat up, confused, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. "Derek, what on earth are you talking about?" I asked him. "It is midnight." "Dad, please," he pleaded. Hearing my hardened son plead sent a spike of ice water straight into my veins. "Victor is in the house. He is not alone. If he knows you are awake, he will silence you. Go to the attic now." Victor. My son-in-law. The man I had personally appointed as the chief operating officer of my logistics company. I gave him that job to keep my daughter Rachel close to home after Catherine died. Why would Victor want to hurt me? Why was the FBI involved? I did not have time to ask. The line went dead. I slowly pushed the heavy duvet off my legs. My knees popped, a sharp pain shooting up my thighs, a souvenir from loading freight in the freezing rain back in the 80s. I ignored it. I planted my bare feet on the cold, hardwood floor and stood up. I did not grab my robe. I did not grab my slippers. I just moved. The house was entirely silent, save for the howling wind outside. I crept into the hallway. The darkness was absolute. I navigated purely by memory, keeping my hands flat against the expensive wallpaper Catherine had picked out a decade ago. Every step felt like a mile. At 76, your body is no longer a weapon. It is a liability. My breathing sounded deafening to my own ears. I reached the end of the hall where the narrow, steep staircase led up to the old attic. I grabbed the wooden handrail and began to climb. The wood groaned under my weight. I stopped, holding my breath, waiting for a shout, a footstep, a gunshot. Nothing. I kept climbing. I reached the top, stepped into the dusty, freezing attic, and gently pushed the heavy wooden door shut. I turned the deadbolt as slowly as humanly possible, wincing at the faint metallic click. I stood there in the dark, shivering in my pajamas, surrounded by old cardboard boxes and forgotten memories. I pulled out my phone to text Derek, but before I could type a single word, I heard it. Voices, muffled, deep, and coming from directly beneath me. They were in my private study. My study was located right below the east side of the attic. I dropped to my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain flaring in my joints. I crawled across the dusty floorboards, guided by a faint sliver of yellow light, slicing through a crack in the wood. I positioned my eye right above the gap and peered down. I expected to see armed robbers. I expected to see men in ski masks tearing my paintings off the walls and emptying the drawers. What I saw was infinitely worse. There were 4 men in my study. 3 of them were dressed in unmarked black tactical gear. They moved with a chilling, silent efficiency, carrying heavy black canvas duffel bags. But it was the 4th man that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. It was Victor, my son-in-law, the man who sat at my dining table every Sunday and carved the roast, the man who kissed my daughter goodnight. He was wearing a tailored suit, looking perfectly calm, pointing directly at the large oil painting on the far wall. Behind that painting was my personal wall safe, a heavy fireproof vault where I kept the master deeds to the 50-acre estate, the corporate stock certificates, and my most sensitive legal documents. Only 2 people in the entire world knew the combination to that safe: me and my late wife, Catherine. I watched paralyzed as Victor stepped up to the keypad. He did not hesitate. He did not use a drill or a blowtorch. He simply reached out and punched in Catherine's birthday, followed by the year we founded the company. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. He knew the code. He had always known the code. The tactical men stepped forward. They unzipped the canvas duffel bags and began pulling out heavy rectangular objects. Server drives. Dozens of black encrypted hard drives. They were not stealing my money. They were not taking my deeds or my gold watches. They were carefully, methodically loading those foreign server drives into my personal safe. They were planting evidence. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stop myself from gasping. The dust in the attic was thick, and a violent tickle built up in the back of my throat. I fought it with every ounce of willpower I possessed. Down below, Victor checked his watch. He murmured something to the men, grabbed one of the hard drives, and carefully wiped it down with a microfiber cloth before placing it on the top shelf right next to my will. My mind raced. Why would my chief operating officer be planting encrypted servers in my personal vault in the middle of the night? Why did my FBI agent son know about it? The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They were framing me. They were using my sanctuary, my private safe, to hide something so radioactive that it required tactical mercenaries to transport it. One of the men suddenly stopped. He raised his hand, signaling the others to freeze. He tilted his head back, his eyes scanning the ceiling. He slowly reached to his tactical belt and pulled out a heavy flashlight. He flicked it on, pointing the blinding white beam directly up at the wooden planks. Directly at the crack where my eye was pressed, I squeezed my eyes shut and rolled away from the gap, holding my breath until my lungs burned. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A single silent vibration. I pulled it out. It was a text from Derek. It read, "Are they gone? Do not touch the safe. Tomorrow morning you need to act exactly like a clueless old man." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone in the suffocating darkness of the attic. I did not type a reply. I did not even breathe. Down below, the blinding white beam of the tactical flashlight lingered on the ceiling for what felt like an eternity. The light sliced through the narrow crack in the floorboards, illuminating the floating dust particles just inches from my face. My lungs were screaming for oxygen. My 76-year-old heart battered against my ribcage with such violent force that I was certain the men in the room below could hear it. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. Please, I thought, do not let them look closer. After an agonizing 10 seconds, the beam of light swept away. The tactical mercenary muttered something unintelligible to Victor. I heard the heavy metallic thud of my personal wall safe being closed and locked. Then came the sound of thick rubber soles moving across the hardwood floor of my study. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Silence slammed back into the house, thick and heavy. I remained frozen on my hands and knees on the freezing attic floor. The winter wind continued to howl outside, rattling the loose shingles above my head, but inside the absolute stillness was terrifying. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. I did not dare to move a single muscle. The cold seeped through my thin pajamas, biting deep into my joints. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the psychological agony tearing through my mind. Victor. The man I had welcomed into my home. The man I had entrusted with the keys to my kingdom. As I lay there shivering in the dust, the memories began to play in my mind like a cruel, mocking film. I thought back to the days right after my wife, Catherine, passed away. Losing her was the only time in my life I had ever truly felt defeated. For 40 years, she was the anchor that kept me grounded while I built my logistics empire. When she died, the silence in this massive 50-acre estate became deafening. I was a broken man, drowning in grief, terrified of spending my final years alone. That fear was my blind spot. It was the only vulnerability I had ever allowed myself to have, and Victor had weaponized it perfectly. My daughter Rachel was my only remaining source of comfort. When she married Victor 8 years ago, I thought I was gaining a son. He was charismatic, sharp, and seemingly devoted to her. After Catherine died, Rachel mentioned that Victor had received a lucrative job offer on the West Coast. The thought of my little girl moving 2,000 miles away was more than I could bear, so I made the worst business decision of my entire life. I offered Victor the position of Chief Operating Officer at my company. I handed him an ungodly salary, full executive benefits, and unprecedented access to our corporate accounts, all just to keep Rachel close to home. I bypassed my most loyal executives to put him in that chair. I blinded myself to his lack of actual logistics experience because I was acting like a desperate, lonely father instead of a seasoned chief executive. I gave him the keys to the castle, and in return, he was using my personal sanctuary to plant encrypted servers alongside my private deeds. The realization tasted like bile in the back of my throat. My trust had not just been misplaced, it had been weaponized. I slowly pushed myself up from the attic floor. Every joint in my body screamed in protest. My knees popped loudly in the quiet space, and I froze again, waiting to see if anyone had heard. But the house remained completely still. I pulled my phone out again. The battery was at 14%. I carefully typed a single letter back to Derek. Yes. I hit send and slipped the device back into my pocket. I knew I could not stay in the attic forever. If Victor decided to check the master bedroom before he left the property, finding my bed empty would sign my death warrant. I had to get back downstairs. I had to climb back under those covers and pretend that my entire world had not just been shattered into a million pieces. I approached the heavy wooden door of the attic. I gripped the deadbolt and turned it with agonizing slowness. It took me a full minute to slide the lock back without making a sound. I opened the door just a fraction of an inch and listened to the hallway. Nothing. The coast was clear. I slipped out of the attic and began the long, treacherous descent down the narrow stairs. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and twist. Every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my exhausted system. I crept past my study. The door was firmly shut exactly as I had left it hours ago. To anyone else, it would look like a perfectly normal room. But I knew the poison that was now locked inside my wall. I reached the master bedroom and closed the door behind me. I climbed into my bed, pulling the heavy duvet up to my chin. My body was freezing, shivering uncontrollably, but my mind was burning with a white-hot, terrifying clarity. I stared up at the dark ceiling, tracing the shadows cast by the moonlight, filtering through the window blinds. Derek had told me to act like a clueless old man. It was a brilliant, necessary strategy. Victor needed to believe that his midnight operation had gone off without a hitch. He needed to believe that his 76-year-old father-in-law was happily asleep, completely oblivious to the fact that his legacy was being dismantled and corrupted. If I showed even a hint of suspicion, if my mask slipped for even a second, Victor would know. And a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. I lay awake for hours, watching the darkness slowly turn into the pale, bruised gray of early morning. I thought about the thousands of miles I had driven in my truck when I was young. I thought about the blizzards I had navigated, the corporate sharks I had outsmarted, and the empire I had built from dirt. I had not survived all of that just to be taken down by a greedy, manipulative coward in a cheap suit. As the sun finally began to rise over the barren winter trees, casting long shadows across my bedroom wall, the last remnants of my fear evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical resolve. Victor thought I was a fragile relic of the past. He thought my age had made me soft, weak, and blind. He was about to learn a very painful lesson. A man who spends his entire life building a fortress knows exactly where every single brick is placed. He knows the weak points, the hidden doors, and the structural flaws. And more importantly, he knows exactly how to lock the gates and trap the intruders inside. I heard the faint sound of footsteps downstairs in the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee began to drift up the staircase. Victor was awake. He was playing the role of the devoted son-in-law, starting his day, as if he had not just orchestrated a massive federal crime under my roof. I took a deep, steadying breath. I arranged my face into a mask of weary, innocent old age. It was time to go down there. It was time to look the devil in the eye, accept a cup of coffee from his hands, and smile. The morning sun crept through the heavy curtains of my bedroom, casting long, pale shadows across the hardwood floor. I had not slept a single second. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blinding white beam of that tactical flashlight sweeping across the attic ceiling. I saw my son-in-law standing in front of my private safe, punching in the numbers of my late wife's birthday with practiced, arrogant ease. At 76 years old, a sleepless night feels like a physical beating. My lower back ached with a dull, grinding pain, and my hands felt stiff. But I forced myself out of bed. I put on my thick wool sweater and my worn slippers. I had a role to play. Derek had told me to act like a clueless old man, and if I wanted to survive this nightmare, I had to give the performance of my life. I walked down the grand staircase of the estate, tracing my hand along the polished mahogany banister. I built this massive house with sweat and blood of 30 years on the road, before the corporate offices and the fleet of thousands of trucks. It was just me, a radio, and endless stretches of asphalt. I knew what hard work felt like. I knew what honesty looked like. And I knew exactly what a liar sounded like. The rich aroma of dark roast coffee drifted down the hallway, pulling me toward the kitchen. As I turned the corner, I saw him. Victor. He was standing by the marble island pouring a fresh cup of coffee. He was dressed in a sharp-tailored navy blue suit, his hair perfectly combed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like the quintessential corporate executive. He looked like the perfect husband to my daughter. He looked like a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. Seeing him standing there, acting so domestic and comfortable in the house I paid for, sent a wave of pure nausea crashing into my stomach. I wanted to grab him by the collar of that expensive suit and throw him out the front door. I wanted to demand answers, but I swallowed the anger. I buried it deep down in my chest, locking it away behind a tired, grandfatherly smile. I shuffled into the kitchen, making sure my steps were a little heavier and a little slower than usual. I coughed weakly, rubbing my chest as I approached the counter to ensure he noticed my frail condition. "Good morning, Victor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, adding just a hint of gravelly exhaustion. Victor turned around, his face lighting up with a warm, welcoming smile. It was a terrifyingly convincing smile. "Good morning, Dad," he replied smoothly. He walked over and handed me a steaming mug of black coffee. You are up early today. Did you sleep all right? I took the warm, heavy mug, wrapping my cold fingers tightly around the ceramic. I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Not really, I muttered, shaking my head. I kept tossing and turning. Actually, I thought I heard some strange noises downstairs last night. Heavy thumping sounds. Did the wind blow a branch against the house? Victor did not flinch. His expression shifted seamlessly into a mask of mild, apologetic concern. "Oh, I am so sorry, Dad," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "The security alarm was glitching due to the storm last night. The perimeter sensors kept sending false alerts to the main panel. I had some techs come out to reset the system and check the wiring. They had to move some furniture around in the east wing. Sorry if it woke you. I should have told them to be quieter." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn the back of my throat. It was the perfect plausible lie. If I had not been in the attic, if I had not seen the tactical gear and the encrypted server drives with my own 2 eyes, I would have believed every single word. I gave him a gentle, reassuring nod. "Oh, that makes sense," I replied, offering him a grateful smile. "With this weather, you can never be too careful. Thank you for handling it, Victor. I appreciate you looking out for us. Anytime, Dad," he said, patting my shoulder. "That is what I am here for." Victor turned his attention back to his phone, scrolling through his emails with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. I turned around and slowly walked out of the kitchen, carrying my coffee mug into the main hallway. As I passed the entrance to my private study, my veteran trucker instincts kicked in. Something caught my eye. Something small. Something out of place on the pristine cream-colored velvet rug resting just outside the heavy oak door of my office. I paused, pretending to catch my breath, and looked down. Woven deep into the pale fibers of the expensive rug was a single distinct smear of dried mud. It was not just regular garden dirt. It was a thick, rust-colored red clay. I stared at that stain, and my blood ran completely cold. I know dirt. When you run an interstate logistics empire, you know exactly what kind of mud gets tracked into your dispatch centers. That specific shade of red clay did not exist anywhere near this 50-acre residential estate. That clay was heavily concentrated at my primary truck dispatch yard, located over 30 miles away in the industrial district. The men Victor brought into my house last night were not random security technicians. They were men who had been walking around my own commercial freight yard. Victor had brought operators from inside my own company to plant those drives. The betrayal was not just happening under my roof. It was actively infecting the business I had spent my entire adult life building. I realized the scope of his operation was massive, and the danger I was in was far greater than I had ever imagined. The corruption was bleeding into the very foundation of my legacy. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. My daughter Rachel came walking down, dressed in a silk robe, yawning and rubbing her eyes. "Good morning, Daddy," she said softly, gently kissing my cheek. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied, forcing myself to maintain the fragile illusion of our happy family. Victor walked out of the kitchen, grabbed his leather briefcase, and kissed Rachel on the forehead. "Have a good day at the office, honey," she told him. "I will," he smiled. "I have a lot of paperwork to get through today. See you tonight, Dad." He opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the bitterly freezing morning air. I stood entirely still in the hallway, listening to the heavy wooden door click shut. I listened to the sound of his luxury sedan starting up in the driveway. I waited until the crunching of the tires on the gravel faded away completely down the long, winding road. The second his car left the property, the facade dropped. My physical exhaustion vanished in an instant. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The morning sun filtering through the drawn blinds was enough. I moved directly to the large oil painting on the far wall, pushing it aside with trembling hands to reveal the cold steel face of my personal vault. I punched in Catherine's birthday and the founding year of our logistics company. The heavy bolts clicked, and the thick door swung open. My breath hitched in my throat. The black canvas duffel bags were gone, but the encrypted server drives were stacked neatly on the top shelf right next to my last will and testament. I reached out and pulled the top drive into the dim light. That was when the bottom fell out of my stomach. Across the seam of the heavy black casing was a thick holographic tamper-evident seal. I recognized the insignia instantly. It bore the official crest of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, right beside the unmistakable logo of the Department of Homeland Security. These were not stolen corporate servers. They were active federal evidence. My mind reeled back to Derek's frantic midnight warning. In the interstate trucking business, dirty money and illicit cargo are the ultimate poison. They are the twin plagues that can dismantle a legitimate empire overnight. Someone was using my commercial freight routes to move something incredibly illegal, and they were using my personal sanctuary to hide the paper trail. I was being framed for a federal crime. Suddenly, the heavy brass doorknob of my study rattled with a sharp, violent jiggle. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Dad, are you in there?" Rachel called out, her voice muffled but carrying a sharp edge of irritation. Dad, why is the door locked?" I had exactly 3 seconds to react. Panic flared in my chest, but I shoved it down. I shoved the server drive back onto the shelf, slammed the heavy steel door of the safe, and spun the dial to scramble the lock. I threw the oil painting back into its original position, just as the doorknob rattled again, this time much harder. "I am coming, sweetheart," I called out, forcing my voice to sound raspy and perfectly benign. I took a deep breath, smoothed my wool sweater, and unlocked the oak door. Rachel stood in the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes darted past me, scanning the dim study with a suspicious, calculating gleam. "Why was the door locked?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. I offered her a tired, apologetic smile, playing the part of the frail old man to absolute perfection. "I am sorry, honey." I sighed, rubbing my temples. I was just looking through some old tax files from the 90s. You know how disorganized I get. I locked the door out of habit. I think my mind is playing tricks on me today. The lie worked seamlessly. Her rigid posture relaxed, replaced by that condescending, pitying look she had adopted over the last few months. "You need to rest, Dad," she said, patting my arm with fake affection. "Leave the paperwork to Victor. He is handling everything perfectly. Why do you not go lay down in the sunroom?" I nodded meekly, agreeing with her, and shuffled down the hallway toward the back of the house. But I did not go to the sunroom. The moment she turned the corner to head upstairs, I slipped through the mudroom and out the side door into the freezing space of my 4-car garage. It was cold enough to see my breath in the air. I walked past the luxury sedans and headed straight for the back corner, where an old grease-stained red steel toolbox sat, forgotten under a tarp. That toolbox was a relic from my days driving freight. I unlatched the heavy metal clasps and dug past the rusted wrenches and old spark plugs until my fingers brushed against a small, stiff plastic bag taped to the false bottom. Inside was an unregistered burner phone. I bought it years ago for emergency dispatch communications on the road, paying in cash. It had no GPS tracking, no registered name, and no corporate connection. It was invisible. I slipped the small black phone into my coat pocket, unlatched the side door of the garage, and stepped out into the freezing November wind. The barren trees of my 50-acre estate offered little protection from the biting cold, but needed absolute privacy. I hiked half a mile into the dense woods behind the main house, my boots crunching softly on the frost-covered dead leaves. Once I was completely hidden by a thick grove of ancient oak trees, I powered on the device. I dialed the secure, direct line Derek had given me years ago for absolute emergencies. The line rang twice before he picked up. The silence on the other end was heavy, cautious, and intensely professional. "Derek," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "I am outside." I checked the safe. They have federal evidence tags on them. IRS and Homeland Security. What is going on? I heard my son exhale a long, ragged breath. He did not sound like the estranged boy I remembered. He sounded like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Dad, listen to me," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Our division has been building a massive federal probe for the last 18 months. Your logistics company is at the very center of it. Victor is not just managing your freight routes. He has been using your interstate trucks to launder tens of millions of dollars for a major drug cartel. The money is being cleaned through phantom shell companies, disguised as operational expenses." I leaned back against the rough bark of an oak tree, feeling the blood drain from my face. My entire life's work had been turned into a criminal enterprise. "But why plant the servers in my safe?" I asked. Derek's voice grew grim. "Because those servers contain fabricated financial ledgers. They bear your digital signature, your authorization codes, and your login credentials. Victor structured the entire operation so that when the FBI inevitably raids the company, you will take the fall. You are the perfect scapegoat, an aging founder who got greedy in his final years." A sharp burst of static crackled across the line. The signal started breaking up. "Dad, you have to be careful," Derek shouted over the static. "The cartel has eyes on the house. They are monitoring the perimeter to make sure you do not try to move the evidence. Do not trust anyone." The call died entirely. A cold terror ran down my spine. I slowly turned my head and looked through the barren trees toward the edge of my property line. Sitting idle on the dirt road, partially hidden by the brush, was a black, unmarked SUV with heavily tinted windows. The engine was running. I was being watched. The black sport utility vehicle sat perfectly still at the edge of the tree line, its dark windows revealing absolutely nothing of the men inside. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull thud that I felt in my throat. I did not panic. I simply turned my back to the vehicle and sank deeper into the dense, frozen woods. I moved with the slow pace of an exhausted old man taking a morning walk, ensuring my posture gave away none of the terror inside my chest. I navigated through the thick brush until I reached the county highway, where I had arranged a meeting with a man I trusted. He was a retired driver named Jackson, one of the original truckers who helped me build my logistics empire. Jackson was leaning against the rusted chrome grille of his battered 1989 Peterbilt when I emerged from the frozen tree line. Despite his age, he still possessed the massive, broad-shouldered frame of a man who had spent decades wrestling heavy freight across mountain passes. He was smoking a cheap cigar, the thick gray smoke mingling with the white exhaust billowing from the truck's idle engine. When he saw me, a multimillionaire CEO emerging from the woods covered in frost dirt and shivering in a torn wool coat, he did not laugh. He simply crushed the cigar under his steel-toed boot and opened the passenger door. "You look like absolute hell, Harrison." Jackson rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. "I feel worse," I replied, climbing into the warm cab. The familiar smell of old leather, diesel fuel, and stale coffee hit me like a wave of nostalgia. It was a sharp reminder of who I truly was before the mansions and the boardroom politics. I pulled out the thick envelope filled with $2,000 in cash and my primary cell phone, handing them across the console. "I need a ghost run, Jack. Drive straight down to Nevada. Do not stop at way stations unless you have to. When you get near Lake Tahoe, power this phone on for exactly 10 minutes, then toss it in a deep ditch." Jackson looked at the envelope, then pushed it back toward my chest. "Keep your money, boss. You paid my daughter's medical bills back in '98 when the company insurance fought me on it. I told you then I owed you my life." He took just the phone and slipped it into his flannel jacket. "I don't know what kind of wolves are chasing you, Harrison. But if you need me to bring some of the old boys together and break some legs, you just say the word." "This is a war I have to fight alone, Jackson," I told him quietly. "Just make sure that phone makes it to Tahoe." He pulled his beat-up truck over to the shoulder. I handed him an envelope filled with $2,000 in cash and my primary cell phone. I told him to drive straight to Nevada, turn the phone on near Lake Tahoe, and leave it in a ditch. He did not ask any questions. He just nodded, took the envelope, and drove away. My decoy was perfectly set. Victor and Rachel would track my phone, believing the clueless old man was halfway across the country. I walked 3 miles down the highway to a truck stop and paid cash for a cheap gray sedan. From there, I drove to an electronics supply store deep in the industrial sector. I could not rely on modern technology. Victor was our chief operating officer. He had total access to the digital infrastructure. He had personally installed the wireless cameras, the smart locks, and the motion sensors. If I set up anything with a wireless connection, his phone would alert him instantly. I needed old-school analog surveillance, equipment that did not send signals through the air. I bought 3 small wired pinhole cameras, 200 feet of thin coaxial cable, and a closed-loop recording monitor. I paid entirely in cash. Afterward, I checked into a grimy roadside motel under a fake name. The room smelled of stale tobacco and bleach, but it was completely off the grid. I sat on the sagging mattress, staring at the pile of cables, preparing to launch my shadow investigation against my own flesh and blood. The isolation of that motel room was suffocating. The flickering neon sign from the parking lot cast long, sickly green shadows across the peeling wallpaper. I took off my heavy winter coat and laid out my tools on the cheap Formica table. Stripping coaxial cables requires a steady hand and sharp eyesight. 2 things that age had brutally attempted to steal from me. My arthritis flared violently, sending sharp, burning needles through my knuckles as I used a small pocket knife to peel back the thick black rubber insulation to expose the copper wiring inside. It took me 3 hours to perfectly splice the hidden camera feeds into the closed-loop recording deck. Every time I messed up a connection, I forced myself to start over. I could not afford a single static interference or a dropped frame. As I sat there in the dim light, binding the wires with black electrical tape, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. I looked haggard, a ghost of the man who once commanded fleets of thousands of trucks. I wondered briefly if Catherine could see me now. I wondered if she would be horrified that I was using the mechanical skills I learned building our first rig to construct a surveillance trap for our only daughter. The emotional toll was heavier than the physical pain. To keep my hands from shaking, I mentally compartmentalized the betrayal. I stopped thinking of Rachel as my child and started viewing her as a critical structural failure in my supply chain. A rogue element that needed to be systematically isolated, documented, and eradicated. I tested the battery packs, calibrated the low-light lenses of the pinhole cameras, and wrapped the entire recording deck in a layer of sound-dampening foam. I packed the gear into a dark canvas duffel bag. By the time I finished, it was past midnight. The trap was meticulously built. Now I just had to survive planting it. I waited until 2 in the morning. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing. I drove the gray sedan back toward my estate, parking it in a deserted cul-de-sac 2 miles away. I hiked the remaining distance through the dense woods, carrying the bag of surveillance equipment over my shoulder. The bitter wind sliced through my coat, biting deep into my 76-year-old joints. My knees groaned with every step over the frozen, uneven terrain. As I broke through the tree line and looked at my mansion, sitting under the pale moonlight, a crushing sadness washed over me. I had built this massive estate to be a fortress for my family. I had poured 30 years of sweat and endless highway miles into creating a safe haven where my wife and daughter would never have to worry. And now, standing in the freezing dark, I was being forced to break into my own sanctuary like a common thief. The betrayal was not just that they wanted my money. It was that they had turned my home into a hostile territory. I approached the eastern wall of the house, staying flat against the brick exterior to avoid the motion sensors Victor had installed. I knew every structural detail of this building because I had approved the blueprints. I knew there was a blind spot in the digital security system. The heavy metal grate covering the basement ventilation shaft was secured by 4 rusted bolts, completely unmonitored by the modern alarms. I pulled a wrench from my bag and went to work. My hands were numb from the cold, shaking, as I forced the rusted metal to turn. It took me 15 agonizing minutes to remove the grate. I slid it aside and stared into the pitch-black, narrow tunnel of the ventilation system. The smell of coal, dust, and old metal hit my face. I took a deep breath, lay flat on my stomach, and began to crawl into the darkness. The physical toll of navigating that cramped metal shaft was agonizing. The space was barely wide enough for my shoulders. I had to drag myself forward inch by inch, using my elbows and toes, gasping for air in the darkness. The metal dug into my chest and knees, scraping my skin raw. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop. At my age, a crawl like this was practically a death sentence, but the image of my daughter and her husband plotting to send me to federal prison fueled a fire inside me that pushed the pain away. I crawled for what felt like an eternity, navigating the metallic maze until I reached the vertical shaft that led directly up to the floor vent in my private study. I pushed myself up, my muscles trembling with exhaustion, and peered through the slats of the brass floor register. The study was pitch black and perfectly silent. I carefully lifted the vent cover and pulled myself up into the room. I did not turn on a flashlight. I worked entirely by touch and muscle memory. I routed the thin coaxial cables through the ductwork, securing the first pinhole camera inside a wooden bookshelf angled directly at the heavy oak door. I wired the second camera into the base of a brass desk lamp, giving it a perfect view of the oil painting that hid my wall safe. It was tedious, nerve-wracking work. I had to ensure the cables were hidden beneath the baseboards and fed safely back down into the ventilation shaft. I connected the video feeds to a small battery-powered recording deck that I stashed deep inside the wall cavity. It would run silently for 48 hours, capturing everything on a local physical drive. No wireless signals, no digital footprints. I secured the final connection and wiped my sweaty palms on my pants. The trap was set. Now I just needed the rats to take the bait. I carefully lowered myself back down into the floor vent and pulled the brass cover securely into place above my head. I was just about to begin the agonizing crawl back toward the basement when I heard it. A sound that made this blood freeze solid in my veins. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were echoing in the hallway directly outside the study. I held my breath, pressing my face against the cold metal of the ductwork. I checked my watch. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. Nobody should have been awake. The heavy brass doorknob of the study slowly turned with a metallic click. The hinges groaned as the heavy oak door was pushed open. A sliver of pale light spilled across the carpet, stopping just inches from the vent where I was hiding. Someone had just slowly walked into the room. The faint sliver of light coming through the brass floor register shifted as a dark shadow moved across the room. My heart pounded fiercely. I was terrified the vibrations would echo through the ventilation shaft. I needed to see who it was, but I was positioned at the wrong angle. I knew I could not stay there. If the intruder heard the rustle of my heavy winter coat against the steel, I would be trapped like a rat. I began the agonizing process of inching backward. Every movement was a calculated risk. I pushed myself back with my toes, dragging my heavy body through the suffocating darkness. Sharp metal edges scraped my elbows, and my knees throbbed with a blinding white-hot pain. It took 20 minutes to navigate the ductwork and reach the vertical drop leading to the basement, when I finally slid out of the ventilation grate and collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. I was drenched in sweat. My chest heaved as I fought to quiet my ragged breathing. The basement was pitch-black silent, except for the low rhythmic hum of the massive industrial furnace in the corner. I dragged myself over to a stack of old wooden shipping pallets, where I had hidden the central hub of my analog surveillance system. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached into the dark crevice and flipped the main power switch on the recording deck. A small monitor flickered to life, casting a ghostly blue light across the damp concrete walls of the boiler room. I grabbed a pair of cheap plastic headphones, plugged them into the audio jack of the recording deck, and pulled them over my ears. The static hissed for a brief second before the audio feed cleared. I leaned forward tightly, my tired eyes locked on the small, grainy screen. I had set up 2 cameras in the study. The first camera, hidden inside the hollowed-out engineering manual on the bookshelf, gave me a wide view of the heavy oak door and the center of the room. The second camera, wired into the base of the brass desk lamp, offered a direct, unobstructed view of the oil painting that concealed my personal wall safe. I stared at the monitor, fully expecting to see Victor. I expected to see my arrogant son-in-law pacing the floor in his expensive tailored suit, double-checking the planted evidence, making sure his master plan to send me to a federal penitentiary was perfectly executed. But the figure standing in the middle of my private study was not Victor. The intruder stepped into the pale moonlight, filtering through the drawn window blinds, turning perfectly toward the camera, hidden in the desk lamp. The breath left my lungs in a sudden, violent rush. It felt as though someone had taken a sledgehammer directly to my chest. It was Rachel, my daughter, my own flesh and blood. She was dressed in dark sweatpants and a simple black hooded sweater, her hair pulled back into a tight, messy knot. She did not look like the sweet, innocent woman who had kissed my cheek and told me to rest in the sunroom just a few hours ago. Her face was set in a cold, rigid expression of pure calculation. There was a chilling mechanical efficiency in the way she moved across the room. She was not sneaking around like someone who was afraid of being caught. She was moving with the supreme confidence of someone who already owned the entire house. I slumped back against the cold concrete wall of the boiler room, pulling the headphones off my ears for a brief moment as a crushing wave of sorrow washed over me. The pain of seeing Victor betray me was immense, but it was nothing compared to the absolute devastation of seeing my daughter standing in that room. My mind pulled me right back to a sterile hospital room 5 years ago. I remembered sitting in a plastic chair, holding Catherine's hand as she lost her battle with a cerebral aneurysm. In her final moments of lucidity, she had looked at me with tears in her tired eyes and made me promise one thing. She made me swear on my life that I would always protect our little girl. I promised her I would. I spent my entire life shielding Rachel from the brutal, ugly realities of the world. I worked 80-hour weeks managing freight yards just so she could grow up in a multi-million-dollar estate with private tutors. I gave Victor the keys to my corporate empire simply to ensure she would never move away. I spent 76 years protecting my daughter from the monsters of the world, never once stopping to consider that she might become one of them. I put the headphones back on my hands, trembling with a newfound, terrifying sorrow. On the screen, Rachel walked directly over to the large oil painting on the far wall. She did not hesitate. She did not look around for instructions. She grabbed the heavy gilded frame with both hands and effortlessly slid it to the right, exposing the thick steel face of my hidden vault. She reached out and punched in the security code without a single second of hesitation. She knew her mother's birthday and the founding year of the logistics company just as well as Victor did. The heavy bolts retracted with a loud metallic clack that echoed through my headphones. Rachel pulled the heavy steel door open and reached inside. She grabbed one of the encrypted server drives, pulling it into the moonlight to inspect the holographic evidence seals from the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Homeland Security. A cold smile of pure, venomous triumph spread across her face. She carefully placed the server back onto the top shelf, closed the safe, and spun the dial to lock it. Then, she reached into the front pocket of her dark hooded sweater and pulled out her cellular phone. I pressed the headphones tighter against my ears, turning the volume dial up to its absolute maximum limit. The audio feed crackled as Rachel dialed a number and held the phone up to her ear. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint rhythmic ringing through the receiver. After 3 rings, someone answered. Everything is perfectly in place, Rachel said, her voice dripping with absolute malice that I had never heard from her before. The old man took the bait perfectly. He is packing his bags for the cabin in Tahoe as we speak. He is completely clueless. Call your contact at the Federal Bureau on Monday morning and tip them off anonymously. Tell them exactly where the safe is located. By the time my stupid father realizes what is happening, the federal agents will have already kicked his door down. He will spend his final miserable years rotting in a federal penitentiary, and Victor and I will take full control of the board. It is finally all over. The line went dead. Rachel lowered the phone and slipped it into her pocket. She stood in the center of my private study, bathed in the pale moonlight, filtering through the blinds. She let out a long, satisfied sigh, rolling her shoulders back, as if a physical weight had just been lifted from her. A cold, victorious smile stretched across her face, transforming her into a complete stranger. This was not the little girl who used to hold my hand. This was a predator standing in my sanctuary, admiring the trap she had just sprung. I sat perfectly still on the concrete floor, staring at the monitor. The headphones felt heavy. I could not move. I could not breathe the damp air. My own daughter, the child I had sworn to protect, was the architect of my destruction. Victor was not the mastermind. He was a cowardly puppet following her directives. Rachel was pulling the strings. She was coordinating with the cartel, orchestrating the laundering of millions through my logistics empire, and arranging my arrest. She wanted me to die alone in a federal penitentiary, just to inherit a company she never built. Why? The question echoed in my mind, ringing with agonizing clarity. I searched my memories, desperately looking for the exact moment her heart had turned so incredibly black. Then the painful realization washed over me. It was not just about the money. The financial greed was only a secondary motivation. The real poison was a deeply rooted resentment that had been festering inside her for decades. It went back to when Derek packed his bags and left Ohio for Washington to join the Federal Bureau. Derek and I possessed the same uncompromising principles. We believed in brutal hard work and earning everything we had. My parenting style was unyielding. I demanded excellence because the world I grew up in did not offer second chances. Derek understood that, but Rachel deeply resented it. She viewed my strict expectations as a lack of affection. When Derek left the family business, she blamed me. When Catherine passed away, leaving a void in this massive estate, Rachel blamed my obsession with the logistics company for stealing the best years of her mother's life. She convinced herself that I was a tyrant. In her corrupted mind, stealing my empire and sending me to prison was not a betrayal. It was an act of justified vengeance. She felt she was owed my kingdom as compensation for the emotional scars she believed I had inflicted upon her. Through the camera feed, I watched Rachel take one final look around the study. She meticulously smoothed the fabric of the velvet rug with her foot, ensuring there were no traces of her presence. She checked the heavy brass doorknob, turned around, and walked out, pulling the oak door completely shut behind her. The blue glow of the monitor cast eerie shadows across the damp walls of the basement. The silence in the boiler room returned heavy and suffocating. I sat there in the dark, letting the devastation wash over me. It felt as though a hunting knife had been plunged directly into my chest and slowly twisted. The family I had spent 76 years sacrificing everything for was an illusion. The wife I loved was gone. The son I respected was estranged, and the daughter I had spoiled and protected had just arranged for my life to end in absolute disgrace. I pulled the headphones off and let them drop onto the floor. I buried my face in my rough, calloused hands. The tears came silent and bitter. I wept for the little girl who used to run out to the driveway to greet my truck after a long haul. I wept for the promises I made to Catherine on her deathbed. I wept for the blind old man who had allowed his desperate fear of loneliness to cloud his judgment. I allowed myself to feel every ounce of that crushing heartbreak. I let the grief consume me entirely, accepting the reality that my family was broken beyond repair. But then, as the tears dried against my weathered skin, something deep inside me began to shift. The sorrow, the pity, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal began to burn away. They evaporated, replaced by a glacial, terrifying rage. The fire that had driven me to build a multi-million-dollar empire from a single rusted truck roared back to life with a vengeance. I lowered my hands and looked back up at the monitor. The screen showed my dark, empty study. My sanctuary. Rachel and Victor thought I was just a senile, clueless old man waiting to die in a rocking chair. They thought my age had made me soft, weak, and utterly defenseless. They had grossly miscalculated. I was not a victim. I was a veteran of the asphalt, a man who had navigated cutthroat corporate sharks and ruthless competitors. I survived because I was disciplined, calculated, and entirely relentless when backed into a corner. If my daughter wanted to play the game of kings, she was about to learn the most devastating lesson of her life. You do not survive 30 years in the interstate logistics business without knowing exactly how to dismantle your enemies. You do not build a fortress without installing hidden trapdoors. I slowly stood up from the cold and damp concrete floor. The agonizing physical pain in my knees and my lower back no longer mattered. The physical exhaustion completely vanished, washed away by a cold mechanical resolve. Rachel had laid out her entire sinister plan with sheer arrogance. I knew exactly what she was going to do next. I now knew the exact timeline. I clearly knew the method. And most importantly, I knew the specific federal agencies she intended to use against me. She had handed me the exact blueprint of my own execution, and I was going to use it to engineer her absolute destruction. I reached out and carefully powered down the analog recording deck. I ejected the physical memory drive containing the high-definition video and the audio of her treacherous phone call. I slipped the drive into the breast pocket of my heavy winter coat, patting it twice to ensure it was secure. I turned around and walked slowly toward the basement ventilation shaft, feeling a newfound strength surging through my veins. I needed to get back into that study tonight. I needed to access my wall safe and examine the encrypted server drives they had carefully planted. I had to know exactly what kind of fabricated financial ledgers they had created to perfectly frame me. My daughter and my son-in-law wanted to destroy the king and permanently steal his hard-earned crown. But they had made one fatal, unforgivable mistake in their arrogant planning. They had left the king breathing. And if you intend to execute the man who built the empire, you had better make absolutely certain you survive his wrath first. I dropped to my stomach, ignoring the freezing cold steel pressing sharply against my bare skin, and began to slowly crawl back into the dark ventilation shaft. I dragged my exhausted body through the ventilation shaft, moving on the adrenaline of a man who watched his daughter sign his death warrant. By the time I tumbled out of the basement grate into the freezing woods, my hands bled and my breathing was ragged. I walked to my hidden sedan and drove to the grimy motel. I spent the next day making preparations. I used the burner phone to call Jonathan Pierce, my corporate attorney. Jonathan is a ruthless, brilliant man who owes his career to me. I gave him highly specific instructions. I needed a clean encrypted laptop, completely untraceable, loaded with military-grade wiping software. More importantly, I needed a payload, a digital tracker that would embed itself into the cartel servers and transmit their hidden offshore routing numbers the moment they accessed the fabricated ledgers. Jonathan delivered the briefcase to a drop point behind a diner by late afternoon. When midnight finally rolled around, I drove back to the perimeter of my estate. The black sport utility vehicle was still idling near the tree line, watching the front gates. They were guarding the house, unaware that the man they were waiting to destroy was slipping through the shadows behind them. I bypassed the security sensors, removed the basement grate, and began the agonizing crawl through the ductwork for the second time. The physical pain was excruciating. Inside my chest numbed the agony. I reached the brass floor register in my study, lifted it silently, and pulled myself up into the dark room. The estate was dead silent. I walked over to the large oil painting, sliding it aside to reveal the heavy steel face of the wall safe. I punched in Catherine's birthday. The metallic click of the heavy bolts retracting felt like a starting pistol. I pulled the steel door open and reached for the encrypted server drives sitting on the top shelf. They were heavy cold and marked with those terrifying federal evidence stickers. I carefully placed them on my mahogany desk, retrieved Jonathan's encrypted laptop, and connected the primary drive using a high-speed data cable. My daughter and her husband had made a catastrophic assumption about me. Because I am 76 years old, they assumed I was technologically illiterate. They thought my expertise was limited to holding a steering wheel and shouting orders at dock workers. They forgot that when the logistics industry transitioned to digital routing in the late 90s, I did not just hire software engineers. I sat in the room with them. I learned the code. I personally helped write the underlying architecture for our interstate dispatch algorithms because I refused to let my company rely on a system I did not intimately understand. I knew how data moved. I knew how to bury a hidden command inside a massive file directory so deeply that no casual forensic scan would ever detect it. I opened the main directory on the cartel server. Victor had been busy. There were hundreds of fabricated spreadsheets, fake invoices, and dummy email threads, perfectly designed to frame me as the mastermind of a massive money laundering operation. My digital signature was stamped on every single fraudulent approval. I initiated the military-grade wiping software. The program began to systematically shred the fabricated ledgers, overwriting the data with randomized code to ensure it could never be recovered. But I did not just delete their work. I replaced it. I executed a secondary command uploading the lethal payload Jonathan had procured. It was a vicious piece of tracking malware. The moment the federal agents or the cartel hackers plugged these drives into their mainframes, the malware would silently copy their entire network directory and transmit it directly to a secure server controlled by my attorney. I was not just destroying their evidence against me. I was stripping away their anonymity. The sheer complexity of Victor's digital forgery was genuinely impressive, making his arrogance all the more infuriating. He had used an algorithmic ghosting program to mimic the exact keystroke rhythm of my digital signature, backdating massive cash transfers to appear as legitimate diesel fuel purchases and warehouse acquisitions over the last 4 years. If a standard federal auditor had looked at these drives, I would have been indicted within the hour. But Victor made the fatal error of building his digital fortress using the underlying corporate network architecture that I had personally designed 20 years ago. He thought he had overwritten the master administrative privileges, but I had built a hard-coded backdoor into the mainframe's root registry long before he even met my daughter. My fingers flew across the keyboard of Jonathan's encrypted laptop, muscles remembering the syntax and commands from a bygone era of early digital logistics. I bypassed Victor's primary firewalls in less than 3 minutes. Once inside the core directory, I unspooled the tracker payload Jonathan had provided. It was a brilliant, vicious piece of code known in intelligence circles as a Hydra. It did not just sit in the background. It actively attached itself to the financial routing protocols. The next time, the cartel's accountants logged in from their offshore locations to check their laundered funds. The Hydra would violently replicate, bypassing their VPNs and locking onto their physical IP addresses. It would essentially paint a glowing digital bullseye on the back of every cartel operator involved, transmitting their exact geolocations directly to the FBI servers. I was turning Victor's ultimate shield into a homing beacon. I sat in the dark, watching the progress bar on the laptop screen slowly creep forward. The only light in the room was the pale blue glow of the monitor, illuminating my weathered hands. The software indicated it would take roughly 12 minutes to complete the secure wipe and plant the tracking malware across all the partitioned drives. Those 12 minutes felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes darting between the laptop screen and the heavy oak door of the study. The house was too quiet. every creak of the floorboards above me, every gust of winter wind rattling the window panes sent a sharp spike of adrenaline straight into my heart. The progress bar reached 80%. I wiped a bead of cold sweat from my forehead. I thought about Rachel. I wondered how she could sleep so soundly upstairs, knowing she had just orchestrated the utter destruction of her own father. I wondered if she felt even a single ounce of guilt, or if her heart was truly as hollow as it appeared on the surveillance monitor. The betrayal still stung a dull ache behind my ribs, but the relentless momentum of my survival plan pushed the sorrow away. The progress bar hit 90%. The cooling fan on the laptop began to whir loudly, fighting the heavy processing load. I quickly draped my thick wool coat over the machine to muffle the sound, holding my breath. 95%. I reached out, ready to pull the data cable the exact second the transfer finished. I needed to get the drives back into the safe, scramble the lock, and disappear back into the ventilation shaft before the sun began to rise. 98%. Then my blood ran cold. The distinct, heavy thud of a footstep echoed from the hallway outside the study. I froze. The progress bar crept to 99% and hung there, the system finalizing the encrypted payload. Another footstep sounded much closer this time. It was not the light, quick step of my daughter. It was the heavy, deliberate tread of a large man wearing hard-soled shoes. Victor. He was awake. He was walking down the main corridor, heading straight toward the study. Panic seized my throat. I desperately looked at the laptop screen. 99%. The system was verifying the hidden directories. If I pulled the cable now, the data corruption would trigger an automatic alert the moment Victor checked the drives. He would instantly know someone had tampered with his planted evidence. He would sound the alarm, the tactical mercenaries outside would swarm the house, and I would never make it out of the estate alive. The footsteps stopped directly outside the heavy oak door. I saw the brass doorknob slowly turn. The metallic click of the latch echoed through the silent room like a thunderclap. I was completely exposed, standing over an open wall safe with a glowing laptop trapped in a room with only one exit. The heavy oak door slowly began to push wide open, casting a long sliver of hallway light across the carpet, and I knew I had absolutely nowhere left to hide. I stood still, watching the brass doorknob finish its rotation. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped, desperate animal. Victor stepped into the room. He did not turn on the overhead lights. He walked straight toward the center of the study, holding a small flashlight. In the split second before he entered, the progress bar on my laptop had finally flashed complete. I had yanked the data cable, shoved the encrypted server drives back onto the top shelf of the safe, and spun the combination dial. But I did not have time to get back to the floor register. Instead, I had rolled silently behind the massive mahogany desk, pulling the heavy velvet drapes around my body, hiding in the narrow gap by the window. Victor paused in the middle of the room. I could hear his heavy breathing. He shined his flashlight directly at the oil painting. I prayed to God I had slid it back into the exact correct position. He stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring at the wall. Then he turned and walked over to the desk. His leather shoes stopped mere inches from my face. I pressed my back against the freezing glass of the window, willing myself to become invisible. If he looked down, if he moved the curtain even an inch, I was dead. But he simply picked up a pen from his desk, turned around, and walked out of the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. I carefully unlatched the window, pushed the glass up, and slipped out into the freezing November night, dropping quietly into the thick bushes below. I scrambled through the dense frozen woods until I reached my cheap gray sedan. I threw the encrypted laptop onto the passenger seat and drove away from the estate. I navigated the dark, icy back roads for an hour until I reached the desolate outskirts of the city. The sky was beginning to turn a bruised purple, signaling the arrival of a cold dawn. I pulled into the empty parking lot of an old truck stop diner. The neon sign above the building buzzed softly in the morning fog. Sitting in the corner booth nursing a cup of black coffee was Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was my corporate attorney, a ruthless and brilliant man who owed his entire career to me. I had pulled him out of a failing law practice 2 decades ago, and in return, he had become the most loyal weapon in my arsenal. I slid into the booth across from him. I did not bother with pleasantries. I unzipped my coat, pulled out the encrypted laptop, and slid it across the sticky laminate table. The machine contained the real cartel ledgers completely extracted from the drives in my safe, along with the undeniable proof of Rachel and Victor orchestrating the entire money laundering operation. Jonathan opened the laptop typed in the decryption sequence we had agreed upon and stared at the screen. The flickering light from the monitor reflected in his dark eyes. He scrolled through the files for 10 minutes in complete silence. The waitress came by to refill his coffee, but he waved her away without looking up. When he finally closed the lid, his face was pale and drawn tight with concern. "Harrison," he whispered, leaning across the table. "Do you understand what you are looking at here? This is not just corporate embezzlement. This is a massive international criminal syndicate. Victor has exposed your entire logistics network to some of the most dangerous people on the planet. And Rachel, my God, she is fully complicit. She is actively directing the cover-up. If we take this to the federal authorities, you are not just blowing the whistle on a financial crime. You are declaring war on your own flesh and blood, and you are declaring war on a cartel that will not hesitate to silence you permanently." I looked out the diner window at the empty highway. I thought about the thousands of miles I had driven, hauling freight through blizzards and storms, sacrificing my health and my youth to build a life where my family would be safe. I thought about Catherine and how much it would break her heart to see what our daughter had become. But the sorrow was gone. Only a cold, burning resolve remained. I turned back to Jonathan and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him I understood the risks perfectly. I built this empire from dirt. I said, my voice steady and completely void of fear. I will burn it back down to dirt before I let them steal it. I told him to secure the data, vet the files for the prosecution, and prepare the legal framework to isolate my liability. I was going to let Rachel trigger her trap, and then I was going to drop the sky on her head. Jonathan nodded slowly. He packed the laptop into his briefcase, stood up, and promised he would have everything ready by the end of the week. He walked out to his car and drove away into the thick morning mist. I stayed in the booth for another 10 minutes, finishing my coffee and preparing myself for the days ahead. I knew I had to go back to the estate. I had to play the part of the tired, oblivious old man returning from a trip to Tahoe. I stood up, left a $5 bill on the table, and walked out the glass doors of the diner. The freezing wind immediately hit my face. I pulled my collar up and walked toward my gray sedan. As I unlocked the car door, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My veteran trucker instincts flared to life. I looked across the empty parking lot. Sitting in the shadows near the edge of the road was a dark, rusted pickup truck with the engine idling. Inside the cab, a heavy-set man was staring directly at me. I was holding a cell phone to his ear, and he did not look away when we made eye contact. I was a cartel scout. They had somehow managed to track my movements. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw the car into drive and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The pickup swerved onto the icy road right behind me. He thought he was chasing a frail old man. He did not realize he was pursuing a veteran driver who spent 30 years commanding massive trucks across treacherous mountain passes. I knew the exact braking point of a vehicle on black ice. I downshifted and took a sharp blind curve at 60 miles an hour. The scout tried to match my speed, but lost traction. I watched his vehicle fishtail wildly and crash into a snowbank. I disappeared into the fog. The morning mist swallowed my car as I navigated the winding back roads toward the estate. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had just handed over explosive digital evidence to my corporate attorney, guaranteeing the destruction of my daughter. A heavy numbness settled over my chest. I drove 20 miles, taking a convoluted route to ensure I was not followed. I parked the sedan in a garage near the regional airport, left the keys under the mat, and hailed a taxi. I had the driver drop me off a mile from my gates. The physical toll of the last 48 hours was finally catching up. My knees felt like crushed glass. My lower back burned with a relentless ache. I was 76 years old, operating on zero sleep, fueled by adrenaline and grief. But as I dragged my suitcase up the gravel driveway, I realized I did not need to hide my exhaustion. I needed to weaponize it. It was Friday morning. Today was the day Rachel and Victor planned to execute their trap. According to the intercepted phone call, they had already tipped off the federal agents. The Bureau was finalizing their raid parameters, preparing to kick my doors down and arrest me for money laundering. My daughter believed I was thousands of miles away, enjoying a peaceful vacation in Tahoe. She thought the authorities would find the fabricated ledgers and leave me rotting in a holding cell. I needed to walk right into her web and smile. I reached the oak doors and unlocked them. I pushed the heavy wood open and dragged my suitcase across the marble foyer, letting the wheels scrape loudly against the floor. I let out a cough, leaning against the wall for support. The house was quiet for a fraction of a second. Then I heard the sharp clatter of silverware dropping in the dining room. Footsteps hurried across the hardwood floor. Rachel and Victor appeared at the end of the hallway. They froze in their tracks. The blood drained from Rachel's face. Victor stumbled backward in pure shock. Dad, Rachel gasped, her voice cracking in a high-pitched squeak. "What are you doing here?" "You are supposed to be in Tahoe." I let out a weak sigh and slumped my shoulders, playing the role of the frail, defeated patriarch to perfection. "I could not do it, sweetheart," I murmured, shaking my head slowly. The altitude in the mountains was messing with my blood pressure. My joints were killing me, and I felt this terrible, heavy feeling in my chest. I took an early red-eye flight back home. I just wanted to be in my own bed. I am getting too old for solo trips. Rachel swallowed hard, exchanging a panicked glance with Victor. Her hands fluttered nervously in front of her. "But Dad, you did not call us. We could have picked you up from the airport. We thought you were gone for the week." I waved a hand, letting a tired smile touch my lips. "I did not want to bother you two. I know how hard Victor has been working at the company." I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and slowly limped toward the main living room, dragging my feet more than necessary. I sank deep into my favorite leather armchair, letting out a groan of relief. "Bring me a cup of hot tea, Rachel." The chill from the flight is sitting deep in my bones. She hesitated before putting on her dutiful daughter mask. "Of course, Daddy. I will be right back." She hurried into the kitchen. I could hear her furiously whispering to Victor. They were scrambling desperately, trying to figure out how my early return impacted their timeline. I leaned my head back against the chair and closed my eyes, listening to the frantic rustling. When Rachel returned minutes later, her hands were trembling so badly that the porcelain teacup rattled against its saucer. She placed the tea on the small wooden table next to my chair. "Here you go, Dad. Drink it while it is hot." "Thank you, honey," I said gently. I picked up the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my freezing fingers. I took a slow sip, looking her directly in the eyes. "I have been doing a lot of thinking on my way back home, Rachel. Sitting on that plane, looking down at the world, you realize how quickly everything can change. You spend your life building an empire, hauling freight across icy highways, fighting for every dollar to make sure your family never goes hungry. And in the end, you ask who will protect your legacy." Rachel smiled tightly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Victor is doing a great job, Dad. You do not have to worry about the company. We have everything under control." Victor walked into the living room, standing behind her, with his hands shoved deep into his tailored slacks. "I am glad to hear that, Victor," I said, shifting my gaze to my son-in-law. "Because loyalty is a rare commodity in our business. In the logistics world, greedy men are always looking for a shortcut. They think they can cut corners, take what does not belong to them, and hide their dirt in someone else's yard. But the consequences of greed always catch up. A man who builds his house on lies will eventually find himself buried. Victor's jaw tightened. He forced a polite, patronizing nod. Absolutely, Harrison. Integrity is everything. I took another sip of my tea, savoring the bitter taste. I watched Victor subtly lift his left arm and glance down at his expensive silver wristwatch. It was a small, arrogant gesture, but it spoke volumes. He was checking the time. He knew the federal agents had already secured the warrant. He knew they were assembling their strike team right now, preparing to raid my estate. In his mind, my unexpected return was just a lucky bonus. Instead of arresting me at an airport days later, the FBI would arrest me right here in my living room. Victor smirked a faint, cold expression of absolute triumph. He genuinely believed I had just willingly walked right into my own execution. I thought I was a naive, exhausted old fool sitting in a leather chair waiting to be slaughtered. He did not know that less than 12 hours ago I crawled through the freezing ventilation shafts of this house. He did not know I had opened the hidden wall safe in my study, bypassed the federal evidence seals, and wiped his fabricated financial ledgers from the encrypted cartel servers. And most importantly, he had no idea that I replaced his planted evidence with a highly lethal tracking payload that was going to expose his offshore accounts and destroy his life. I sat there in the quiet warmth of my living room, letting the silence stretch out between the three of us. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was in place. Now all I had to do was wait for the wolves to kick the door down. The wait was not a long one. For a few fleeting moments, the living room felt entirely normal. The towering mahogany grandfather clock in the long hallway ticked with a slow, steady, rhythmic pulse, counting down the seconds to their inevitable ruin. The winter sun struggled to pierce through the heavy gray clouds outside the large bay windows. I watched Victor out of the corner of my eye. He was standing near the fireplace, trying to look casual, but his body language betrayed him. He shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. He ran a hand over his perfectly styled hair. He glanced down at his expensive silver wristwatch for the third time in less than 5 minutes. He was expecting the federal raid to happen at any second, and the anticipation was causing his polished corporate facade to crack. Rachel was sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa across from me, pretending to read a lifestyle magazine. She turned the glossy pages with exaggerated care, not actually reading a single word. I simply rested my hands on my lap, feeling the warm porcelain of my teacup against my cold palms, while the heavy burden of their deceit weighed heavily on my soul. I regulated my breathing, keeping my chest rising and falling at the slow, measured pace of an exhausted old man. And then it finally started. It began as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing through the barren winter trees miles away. At first, it sounded like the freezing wind howling across the valley. But my ears are trained to catch the smallest shifts in sound. I immediately knew exactly what it was. The heavy, unmistakable drone of federal sirens cutting through the morning fog. Victor heard it too. His head snapped toward the windows, his eyes widening in a feigned expression of shock. He looked at Rachel, delivering a silent, triumphant signal. The sirens grew louder, multiplying in number, transforming from a distant whine into an overwhelming, chaotic chorus. It sounded like an entire armada of emergency vehicles was speeding down the long, winding road that led directly to my front gates. The noise bounced off the brick walls of the estate, shattering the quiet sanctuary of the neighborhood. That was when Rachel began her spectacular performance. She let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. She intentionally loosened her grip on her porcelain teacup, letting it slip through her fingers. The fragile porcelain cup hit the solid hardwood floor, shattering instantly into a dozen jagged white pieces that scattered violently across the room. Hot tea splashed across the polished wood and soaked into the edges of the expensive rug. Oh my God. Dad, what is happening? She screamed, jumping up from the sofa. Her voice was laced with a perfectly engineered panic. She grabbed the sides of her face wide-eyed and trembling, putting on a display worthy of an Academy Award. Is there an emergency? Why are there sirens coming up our driveway? I did not flinch. I did not jump out of my chair or drop my own cup. I did not look toward the window or ask what was going on. I remained completely and utterly still. I slowly lifted my teacup to my lips, blew softly on the steaming liquid, and took a long, deliberate sip. The warm tea slid down my throat, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I placed the cup back down on the saucer with a soft, steady clink. My dead calm demeanor was not part of their script. They had anticipated confusion. They had expected an ailing, terrified old man to start panicking, clutching his chest and begging them to explain what was happening. My absolute silence unnerved Victor. He took a hesitant step away from the fireplace, his brow furrowing in confusion. He stared at me, trying to read the expression on my weathered face. I just looked back at him, my eyes empty and devoid of any fear. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to stew in the awkward, heavy tension. The sirens were deafening, now vibrating through the thick glass of the bay windows. The massive, heavy iron security gates at the main entrance of the large estate groaned incredibly loudly as they were forcefully and violently pushed wide open. The sound of multiple heavy vehicle tires crunching aggressively over the gravel driveway filled the living room. Rachel continued her hysterical act, rushing over to the window and peering through the blinds. "There are police cars everywhere," she cried out, her voice shaking with fake terror. "They are blocking the entire driveway. Victor, what is going on? Who are these people?" Victor swallowed hard, trying to regain control of the narrative. He rushed over to her side, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. "Stay calm, Rachel," he said loudly, making sure I could hear every word of his heroic performance. "I will handle this. I do not know what is happening, but I will not let anyone hurt you or your father. Just stay back." He turned his gaze back to me, clearly disturbed by the fact that I had still not moved a single muscle. "Dad, you need to stay in your chair," Victor ordered, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of my unblinking stare. "This might be a mistake. Just let me do the talking." I did not answer him. I simply rested my hands on the armrests of my leather chair and waited. Through the large bay windows, a terrifying kaleidoscope of flashing red and blue lights illuminated the living room walls. The frantic strobing colors painted the faces of my daughter and my son-in-law, casting long, erratic shadows across the shattered pieces of porcelain on the floor. I could hear the heavy doors of the federal vehicles slamming shut one after another. The sharp, authoritative shouts of tactical agents echoed across the front lawn, barking orders to secure the perimeter of the estate. Dozens of boots stomped aggressively across the frosted grass, ascending the stone steps of the front porch. The chaotic noise outside stood in stark contrast to the absolute stillness inside my mind. Victor stood frozen in the center of the room, his chest heaving, waiting for his masterpiece to unfold. He thought he had won. He genuinely believed that the armed men outside were here to take my life away, leaving him with an untouched multi-million-dollar empire. The heavy booming sound of a fist pounding against the front doors echoed down the hallway. It was a terrifying, violent demand for entry. Federal agents opened the door, a booming voice shouted from the porch. Rachel let out a piercing scream, clinging desperately to Victor's arm. Before Victor could even take a step toward the entryway, a massive, deafening crash shook the entire foundation of the house. The heavy, solid wooden front doors of my home were violently kicked wide open, sending thick splinters of wood flying straight across the marble foyer floor. The cold winter air rushed inside, bringing the storm into our lives. There was no turning back now. The absolute reckoning had finally arrived. Dozens of armed federal agents poured into the grand foyer, their heavy tactical boots trampling over the shattered wood and imported rugs. The sheer physical force of the breach was overwhelming. Men and women wearing dark Kevlar vests with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their chests swarmed the living room in a matter of seconds. They moved with a terrifying practiced efficiency. Flashlights swept across the walls, cutting through the dim winter morning light. Weapons were drawn and pointed toward the floor, ready to be raised at the slightest provocation. The lead agents barked sharp, deafening orders, demanding that everyone keep their hands visible and step away from any furniture. Victor immediately grabbed Rachel and pulled her against his chest, playing the role of the fiercely protective husband. He raised his free hand high into the air, his eyes wide, projecting absolute compliance and innocent terror. I did not move. I remained seated in my leather armchair, resting my hands flat against my knees. A tall agent stepped directly in front of me, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. He ordered me to stay exactly where I was and not to make any sudden movements. I offered him a slow, confused nod, looking around the room as if I had absolutely no idea why the federal government had just battered down my front doors. Through the chaotic sea of dark uniforms and flashing lights, a familiar figure stepped over the ruined threshold. It was Derek, my oldest son. He was dressed in the same heavy tactical gear as the rest of the strike team, his face set into a mask of pure, unyielding stone. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. The gray at his temples was more prominent, and the lines around his mouth were deeply etched with the stress of his career. He walked into the center of my ruined living room with the authority of a man who was entirely in control of the operation. The noisy room seemed to quiet down just a fraction as he took his position. For the first time in 8 long months, my son and I locked eyes. There was no warmth in his gaze. There was no hesitation or familial affection. He stared at me with the cold, detached scrutiny of a seasoned federal agent sizing up a prime suspect. It was a flawless performance. I had to treat me exactly like a criminal mastermind to ensure that Victor and Rachel suspected absolutely nothing about our secret coordination. I stared back at him, letting my jaw drop slightly, mimicking the shock of an aging father watching his estranged son raid his home. Derek broke the eye contact and turned his attention to the rest of the room. He announced that they were executing a federal search warrant regarding an ongoing investigation into corporate money laundering and organized crime. Before he could even finish his sentence, Rachel broke away from Victor. She stumbled forward, her knees seemingly weak, sobbing hysterically. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "He has a safe," she screamed, her voice cracking with perfectly manufactured devastation. She looked around at the federal agent's, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "My father has a hidden wall safe in his private study. He has been locking himself inside for weeks. He has been hiding things from us. You have to check the safe. Please, I do not know what he has been doing, but you have to look in there." It was a spectacular display of calculated betrayal. She was playing the terrified whistleblower, the innocent daughter who had just discovered her father was a monster. Victor stood behind her, his hands covering his mouth in an expression of absolute disbelief. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, whispering to her that everything was going to be all right, that they were doing the right thing by telling the truth. Derek narrowed his eyes, staring at his sister as if she were just another civilian informant. He demanded to know exactly where the study was located. Rachel pointed desperately down the main hallway, her chest heaving with fake sobs. Derek turned to his team, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He ordered 4 agents to breach the study, locate the hidden vault behind the oil painting, and extract whatever was inside. I knew I had to sell my part of the illusion right then and there. I pushed myself up from my armchair, my legs shaking, and raised my voice in feigned outrage. "You cannot do this," I shouted, forcing a desperate tremor into my throat. "This is my home. You have no right to tear my house apart based on lies." Derek stepped directly into my path, forcing me back down into the chair with a firm, commanding push to my shoulder. He looked down at me, his face inches from mine, and told me that I was officially a subject of a federal probe. He advised me to remain seated and keep my mouth shut unless I wanted to be placed in handcuffs immediately. I slumped back into the leather cushions, burying my face in my hands, painting the picture of a broken, defeated old man watching his empire crumble. The agonizing and brutal wait began. The agents disappeared down the corridor, their boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The living room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Victor stood by the fireplace, his arm wrapped tightly around Rachel. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching and unclenching. He was trying to suppress a triumphant smirk. He knew exactly what the agents were going to find behind that oil painting. He knew they were going to pull out the encrypted server drives, loaded with the fabricated financial ledgers, all conveniently stamped with my digital signature and executive authorization codes. In his greedy, corrupt mind, the trap had worked flawlessly. He believed he was minutes away from watching me being hauled off to a federal penitentiary for the rest of my life. 10 long minutes passed like hours. Finally, the footsteps returned down the hallway. The lead agent emerged into the living room, carrying 3 heavy black server drives. He walked directly over to Derek and nodded. They found the vault, the agent confirmed. The federal evidence tags were still intact. Victor squeezed Rachel gently, a silent celebration of their total victory. He could barely hide the gleaming satisfaction in his dark eyes. Derek ordered his technical specialist to set up a secure terminal right there on my mahogany coffee table. The specialist unzipped a heavy tactical backpack, pulled out a thick, ruggedized laptop, and placed it on the glass surface. He booted up the machine, the screen glowing a bright, harsh blue in the dim room. Victor leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto the black server drives. He was waiting for the final nail in my coffin. He thought he had outsmarted the veteran trucker, the relentless chief executive, the clueless old man. The specialist grabbed the data cable, plugged it directly into the encrypted server, and hit the execution key. The heavy silence in the living room was punctuated only by the low mechanical hum of the hard drive spinning to life. Victor took a half step forward, his eyes practically glowing with dark anticipation. He was holding his breath, waiting for the digital ledgers to populate the screen. Waiting for the definitive proof that would send his father-in-law to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. Rachel kept her face buried in the shoulder of Victor, her own shoulders heaving with fake theatrical sobs. She was playing the heartbroken daughter to the very last second. Derek stood behind the technical specialist, his arms crossed over his tactical vest, his face a completely unreadable mask of stone. I remained perfectly still in my leather armchair, resting my hands on my knees. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. The trap I had spent the last 48 hours agonizingly building in the freezing shadows of my own home was finally springing shut. A bright green loading bar flashed across the ruggedized laptop screen. The decryption software bypassed the outer layers of the server, slicing through the digital security protocols Victor thought were impenetrable. A series of file folders appeared on the desktop. Victor smirked, a cruel, arrogant twisting of his lips. I thought those folders contained the fabricated financial spreadsheets, the dummy invoices, and my digitally forged signatures approving the cartel money laundering operations. The technical specialist double-clicked the primary directory file, but a spreadsheet did not open. No financial ledgers flooded the screen. Instead, a high-definition media player automatically launched, expanding to fill the entire monitor. The living room fell into absolute suffocating confusion. Victor frowned, his smirk faltering as his eyes darted from the screen to the specialist. "That is not right," he muttered, his voice dropping its confident edge. "Open the financial index." "What is this?" The specialist ignored him, letting the media file buffer and play. A crystal-clear black and white video feed illuminated the screen. It was analog footage completely immune to their digital network sweeps. The camera angle was positioned perfectly from the base of the brass desk lamp in my private study. The timestamp in the corner read 3 in the morning, dating back to the exact night I was hiding in the damp boiler room. The heavy oak door of the study pushed open on the screen, and a figure walked into the pale moonlight. The theatrical sobs suddenly died in the throat of Rachel. She lifted her head, her eyes locking onto the bright laptop monitor. On the screen, Rachel walked directly toward the oil painting, dressed in her dark sweatpants and hooded sweater. She slid the heavy frame aside, revealing the hidden wall safe. Victor froze completely. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening in a silent gasp of sheer terror. He stared at the screen as his wife effortlessly punched in the passcode, yanked the heavy steel door open, and pulled out one of the encrypted server drives to inspect the federal evidence tags. Then, the high-definition audio kicked in, projecting clearly through the laptop speakers and echoing off the walls of my living room. "Everything is perfectly in place," the recorded voice of my daughter said, dripping with venom and malice. "The old man took the bait perfectly. He is packing his bags for the cabin in Tahoe as we speak. He is completely clueless. Call your contact at the Federal Bureau on Monday morning and tip them off anonymously. Tell them exactly where the safe is located. By the time my stupid father realizes what is happening, the federal agents will have already kicked his door down. He will spend his final miserable years rotting in a federal penitentiary, and Victor and I will take full control of the board." It is finally all over. The audio recording ended, but the laptop was not finished. The military-grade wiping software I had used to eradicate their fabricated evidence executed its final command. A secondary window popped up on the monitor, displaying a massive list of international bank routing numbers. Derek leaned forward, reading the screen aloud for the entire room to hear. "These are offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands." Derek announced, his voice booming with federal authority. "Registered exclusively to Victor and Rachel. The accounts hold deposits matching the exact laundered amounts from the cartel operation." I sat back in my armchair, watching the exact moment, the color completely drained from the face of my daughter. It was a spectacular, horrifying transformation. The warm, flushed skin of her cheeks turned a sickly ashen gray. The manufactured tears dried up, instantly replaced by a wide, unblinking stare of pure, unadulterated panic. The arrogant, untouchable aura she had carried into this room shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The hunters had just realized, in the most brutal and public way possible, that they were the prey. They had walked blindly into an execution, but it was not mine. It was theirs. I had taken their meticulously crafted weapon, dismantled it in the dark, and turned it directly against them. The silence in the room was heavier than concrete. Even the federal agents stood perfectly still, their hands resting on their weapons, watching the family dynamic completely implode in real time. Rachel snapped. The realization that she was facing decades in a federal prison broke her mind. She let out a feral, guttural scream and lunged violently at her husband. She slammed her fists into the chest of Victor, her fingernails clawing frantically at the lapels of his expensive, tailored suit. "It was all his idea," she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the high ceilings of the foyer. "He made me do it. He set up the accounts. He brought the cartel into the company. I had nothing to do with this." Victor shoved her backward with such raw, panicked force that she stumbled and fell hard onto the floor, scraping her hands against the shattered porcelain of her broken teacup. Blood began to pool around her palms, but she did not seem to feel the physical pain. She just kept screaming desperately, attempting to rewrite the undeniable reality displayed on the monitor. Victor completely ignored her agonizing wails, his eyes darting frantically between the heavily armed federal agents surrounding him. He knew his life was effectively over. He spun around, raising his hands toward Derek in a desperate, trembling gesture of surrender. "Wait," Victor begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I can give you the cartel leaders. I can give you the distribution routes. I have ledgers hidden in a secure lockbox downtown. Just give me immunity. Please, you have to give me a deal." I watched them tear each other apart with a cold, absolute indifference. The nightmare was finally ending right in front of my weary eyes. The house of cards had completely collapsed, leaving nothing but the pathetic ruins of their greed on my living room floor. I simply sat there, the sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around the wrists of my son-in-law echoed through the ruined living room. It was a terribly final sound. Victor stopped his pathetic, high-pitched whining the moment the cold metal locked his arms firmly behind his back. The federal agent standing behind him shoved him roughly toward the center of the grand foyer, forcing him to stand next to the shattered remnants of the front doors he had once walked through with such arrogant pride. Victor kept his eyes fixed on the hardwood floor, utterly humiliated, unable to look me in the face. His expensive, tailored suit was rumpled and torn from where my daughter had viciously clawed at his chest just moments before. Rachel was still on her knees. The federal agents had given her a wide berth, waiting for Derek to give the official command to restrain her. She stared at the bright, glowing screen of the ruggedized laptop sitting on my mahogany coffee table. The analog video feed had finished playing, leaving only the digital list of her secret offshore bank routing numbers, completely exposed for the entire world to clearly see. The undeniable proof of her treason was frozen on the monitor. She slowly turned her head away from the computer and looked up at me. Her dark eyes, the same eyes that belonged to my late wife, Catherine, were completely wild with a desperate animalistic panic. She scrambled across the expensive velvet rug, her knees sliding through the spilled lukewarm tea and the jagged broken shards of porcelain from the teacup she had dramatically dropped just 15 minutes ago. She did not care that the sharp ceramic edges were cutting deeply into her skin. She reached my leather armchair and threw her arms around my legs, sobbing with a frantic, breathless intensity. "Dad," she wept, her tears soaking into the fabric of my trousers. "Dad, please. You have to stop them. Tell them it is a mistake. I did not mean for any of this to happen. Victor poisoned my mind. He told me you were going to sell the company and leave us with absolutely nothing. I was just scared. I am your little girl. You promised Mom you would always protect me. Please, Daddy, do not let them take me away. I will do anything you want. I will give back every single penny. Just tell them to let me go." I looked down at the top of her head, watching her tremble. For 76 years, my entire existence had been defined by my absolute duty to my family. I had driven heavy freight trucks through blinding snowstorms, broken my back loading cargo, and ruthlessly fought corporate competitors to ensure that the woman sobbing at my feet would never experience a single day of hardship. I had given her a life of absolute luxury and privilege. In return, she had plotted to drug my mind, steal my legacy, and lock me in a psychiatric ward to die entirely alone. I placed my hands on the sturdy armrests of my leather chair and slowly pushed myself up. My joints ached with a dull, grinding pain, but I forced my posture to remain perfectly straight. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not offer her a shoulder to cry on. I stepped back, forcing her to release her desperate grip on my legs. Rachel slumped forward onto the ruined rug, her face buried in her hands, weeping loudly. I stared down at her with a glacial, empty indifference. The father who had loved her unconditionally had died the moment I looked through the floorboards of the attic and saw the federal evidence tags on those encrypted servers. The man standing over her now was simply the chief executive of a multi-million-dollar empire, inspecting a catastrophic failure in his supply chain. "I built a foundation of steel," I told her. My voice was incredibly calm, yet it carried a heavy, resonant authority that silenced the entire room. "I built it with my own 2 hands, so that you would always have a safe place to stand. And instead of honoring that, you chose to be rot. You let greed infect your soul until there was absolutely nothing left of the daughter I proudly raised." I shifted my gaze toward the federal agents standing by the door. "Take them out of my house," I commanded. The agents moved with swift, emotionless precision. Two officers hauled Rachel up from the floor, pulling her arms tightly behind her back. She thrashed and screamed, calling my name, begging for a mercy she did not deserve. The metallic snap of the second pair of handcuffs cut through her wails. They marched her forcefully out the front door, pushing her out into the freezing November morning. Victor was dragged out immediately behind her, his head hanging low in absolute disgrace. The chaotic noise moved out onto the front lawn. I stood in the center of my living room, completely ignoring the frantic shouts of the federal agents securing the suspects outside. I turned my attention to the only other person left standing near the fireplace, my oldest son. Derek had not spoken a single word during the entire confrontation. He stood tall in his dark tactical vest, his face a perfect mask of hardened discipline. We locked eyes. There were no tears between us. There was no need for a dramatic emotional embrace. We were two stubborn, unyielding men who had spent years separated by our own rigid principles only to be brought back together by a shared dedication to the absolute truth. Derek gave me a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent moment of profound respect. I was acknowledging the brutal strength it took for a father to hand over his own daughter to the federal justice system. I nodded back a quiet thank you for the midnight warning that had saved my life. Without another word, Derek turned around and walked out the shattered front doors, disappearing into the flashing red and blue lights of the federal convoy. I walked over to the large bay windows and stood perfectly still. I watched the heavy doors of the dark sport utility vehicles slam shut, trapping Rachel and Victor inside. The massive convoy of federal agents slowly reversed down my long gravel driveway, their sirens completely silenced now that the high-value targets were securely in custody. I watched until the very last flashing light vanished through the heavy iron gates at the edge of my 50-acre estate. The estate fell into a deep, overwhelming silence. The winter wind continued to howl against the thick glass, but inside the mansion, there was absolutely nothing but the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock. I turned around and surveyed the immense damage. The expensive velvet rug was soaked with cold tea and stained with muddy footprints. The house was empty. I reached into the deep pocket of my thick wool sweater and pulled out my primary cell phone. I dialed my corporate attorney to begin the brutal restructuring process. The storm had passed. The following morning brought a cold, brilliant sunrise that washed the frost from the barren trees surrounding my estate. The storm had truly passed, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. But for the first time in nearly a decade, that silence did not carry the crushing weight of loneliness. It carried the undeniable clarity of survival. I spent the next 6 months executing a ruthless, systematic purge of my corporate empire. Jonathan Pierce and his team of forensic accountants tore through every ledger, every contract, and every dispatch manifest. We rooted out every single shell company and severed all ties with any executive who had turned a blind eye to the cartel operations. I did not just fire them. I handed their files directly to the federal authorities. The Monday following the arrests, I called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. These were the men and women Victor had brought in, slick, fast-talking corporate executives who cared infinitely more about quarterly profit margins than the actual blood and sweat it took to move heavy freight across the country. I walked into the glass-walled conference room overlooking the main dispatch yard wearing my old steel-toed work boots and a tailored suit. They looked at me as if a ghost had just kicked down the door. I did not sit at the head of the table. I stood by the window watching the trucks roll out, and then I dropped a thick, leather-bound folder onto the polished mahogany. It contained the digital footprints, the intercepted emails, and the financial anomalies they had either willfully ignored or actively facilitated to appease Victor. I watched the color drain from their perfectly manicured faces as I read off their immediate severance terms. There would be no golden parachutes. There would be no quiet resignations or glowing letters of recommendation. I told them they had exactly 15 minutes to clear out their desks before corporate security physically removed them from the premises. A few of them attempted to protest, threatening massive lawsuits and citing their ironclad employment contracts. I leaned over the table, looked the loudest vice president dead in the eyes, and offered to call Derek's federal task force right then and there to see if the FBI wanted to negotiate those contracts instead. The room emptied in absolute terrified silence. Walking through the newly vacated executive floor, I felt the heavy, suffocating atmosphere completely lift from the building. I was violently excising the tumor Victor had planted, and my company could finally breathe again, to rebuild the foundation. I went down to the loading docks. I promoted the men and women who had been moving freight and managing yards for 20 years. I put the people who understood the true value of honest labor into the corner offices. The federal trial for Rachel and Victor began in the spring. I attended every single day of the proceedings, sitting in the back row of the gallery, dressed in my best tailored suit. My daughter refused to look at me. She sat at this defense table, her posture rigid, her face devoid of the arrogant, untouchable smirk she used to wear. The mountain of undeniable evidence we provided left them absolutely no room to maneuver. They were both convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud conspiracy and attempting to defraud a federal institution. The courtroom was a theater of absolute destruction for the two of them. Victor attempted to strike a plea deal on the very first day, cowardly offering to testify against Rachel in exchange for leniency. He claimed he was a victim of her manipulation, that she was the true mastermind who had brokered the deal with the cartel. But the federal prosecutors did not need his testimony. The tracking malware I had planted on the servers had done its job flawlessly. It had successfully unmasked 3 mid-level cartel distributors, triggering a massive international raid that dismantled the entire laundering syndicate. Victor and Rachel were left with absolutely no leverage. The defining moment of the trial occurred during the second week. The prosecution introduced the analog video and audio recording from my private study. As the crystal-clear audio of Rachel eagerly planning my arrest and demise echoed through the silent, crowded courtroom, the entire jury visibly recoiled. I watched Rachel shrink into her chair, her face burying into her hands as her own venomous words sealed her fate. Her defense attorney stopped taking notes and simply stared at the desk. There is no legal defense against pure, unadulterated malice captured in high definition. When Victor took the stand in his own defense, his arrogance was entirely gone. He sweated profusely under the harsh courtroom lighting, stuttering as the prosecuting attorneys meticulously dissected his offshore accounts. The men from the cartel were watching too. Unnamed men in sharp suits sat in the back rows of the gallery every day, silently reminding Victor that even if he survived a federal prison sentence, the syndicate would never forgive him for exposing their network. I was a dead man walking, and the sheer terror in his eyes confirmed he knew it. As the judge handed down their lengthy prison sentences, I did not feel a shred of triumph. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The rot had finally been excised from my life. I formally rewrote my will the very next week, permanently stripping Rachel of any claim to the empire I had built. The multi-million-dollar estate and the logistics company would be placed into an irrevocable trust, structured to provide full scholarships for the children of my most loyal drivers and warehouse workers. With the agonizing legal battles concluded and the logistics empire firmly back in my grasp, there was one final, deeply personal debt I needed to pay. On a crisp, terribly windy afternoon, I drove my old gray sedan to the quiet hilltop cemetery located on the outskirts of the city. I walked a familiar, lonely path past the ancient weeping willows until I reached Catherine's headstone. It was carved from heavy, dark granite, standing resolute and unyielding against the biting Ohio winter wind. I knelt in the damp grass, completely ignoring the dull, grinding ache in my damaged knees, and placed a fresh bouquet of white lilies at the base of the stone. For a very long time, I could not find the right words. The immense guilt of what had happened to our daughter sat heavily on my chest. I had promised Catherine on her deathbed that I would protect Rachel, and in a twisted way I felt I had failed us both. But as I traced the cold, engraved letters of Catherine's name with my calloused fingers, the heavy burden of my shame slowly began to lift. I spoke out loud to the empty wind, telling my late wife absolutely everything. I told her about the brutal betrayal, the blinding fear, the cartel, and the agonizing choice I had to make to save our life's work. I explained that protecting Rachel could no longer mean shielding her from the devastating consequences of her own monstrous greed. Sometimes, true love requires breaking the very thing you swore to keep whole. I felt a strange, quiet warmth wash over me as I finally stood up. I did not know if Catherine would ever forgive me for sending our only daughter to a federal penitentiary for decades, but I knew with absolute certainty that she would be intensely proud I did not let the empire we built together be swallowed by corrupt darkness. I whispered a final goodbye, turned my back to the gravesite, and walked down the hill. For the first time in years, my steps felt incredibly light. A few weeks after the sentencing, a sleek black federal vehicle pulled into my gravel driveway. I was sitting on the front porch watching the late afternoon sun dip behind the ancient oak trees. Derek stepped out of the car dressed in civilian clothes. He looked relaxed, the heavy burden of the undercover investigation finally lifted from his shoulders. He walked up the stone steps and sat down in the wooden chair next to me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We just watched the wind rustle through the leaves, sharing the comfortable silence that only two men who had fought a bitter war could truly understand. I reached down beside my chair, picked up a heavy crystal decanter, and poured 2 glasses of neat-aged bourbon. I handed one to my oldest son. He took it, raising the glass slightly, in a silent toast to the legacy we had managed to save. We did not apologize for the years we spent apart. We did not need to. We simply drank our bourbon, bridging the massive gap that had separated our stubborn hearts for far too long. As the evening shadows stretched across the vast, empty lawn, I realized something profound about the nature of building an empire. You can spend your entire life hauling freight across treacherous highways, fighting corporate battles, and sacrificing your youth to construct a beautiful fortress for the people you love. But a fortress is only as strong as the people you allow inside its walls. I had invited snakes into my sanctuary because I was desperately afraid of growing old alone. I had let my desire for a perfect, happy family blind me to the terrifying reality of human greed. But I survived the venom. I took my kingdom back, and I secured my legacy on my own uncompromising terms. Today, my 50-acre estate is quieter than it has ever been. The grand hallways echo with absolutely nothing but the slow ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock. I walk these empty floors every single day with a renewed, unbreakable strength in my aching legs. I am 76 years old, but I am no longer an exhausted, fading patriarch, passively waiting for the bitter end. I am the sole architect of my own destiny, a lone wolf proudly watching over a clean, uncorrupted, and thriving empire. I finally found the absolute peace I had been searching for all my life, not in the false comfort of a treacherous family, but in the unyielding, quiet strength of my own survival. The long, open road ahead is mine to navigate, and I will proudly drive it alone. There is a profound tragedy in realizing that the empire you built to protect your family has become the very thing they will kill you for. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and age does not mean you must become a victim. I learned that the predators you need to watch out for are not always lurking in the shadows outside. Sometimes they are pouring your morning coffee. A man who carefully builds a fortress with his own 2 hands knows every hidden door and blind spot. Never let your love for your children blind you to their true dark nature. Did this story make you question who you truly trust? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories. Remember, the truth always comes to light. Stay very vigilant.